Operation Mincemeat. The corpse that fooled Hitler. April 30th, 1943. A fisherman off the coast of Spain pulls something from the water. It's a body. A British Royal Marine officer, floating face down, still wearing his uniform. A briefcase is chained to his wrist. Spanish authorities notify the British. They're sympathetic, apologetic. They'll return the body with full military honors. But first, they need to examine the briefcase. Just routine procedure. Standard protocol for a neutral country. The briefcase contains letters, military correspondence, and detailed invasion plans showing exactly where the Allies intend to strike Nazi-occupied Europe. Spain, officially neutral but quietly sympathetic to Nazi Germany, photographs every document. Within days, copies reach Berlin. They land on Hitler's desk. The Führer studies them carefully. He repositions his forces, reinforces defenses, prepares for the Allied invasion exactly where the documents indicate it will come. There's just one problem. The body wasn't a British officer. The invasion plans were fake. The entire thing was an elaborate deception designed by British intelligence. And it worked so perfectly that it changed the course of World War II. Welcome to Echoes of WW2. Today we're going to tell you about Operation Mincemeat, perhaps the most audacious, macabre, and successful intelligence operation in military history. A plan so bizarre that it sounds like a spy novel. A deception so intricate that even 70 years later, historians are still uncovering new details. This is the story of how a corpse, a briefcase, and a handful of spies convinced Hitler to defend the wrong beaches and gave the Allies the opening they needed to invade Europe. And it all started with two men in a London basement, trying to solve an impossible problem. Let's go back to late 1942. World War II has been raging for 3 years. Britain stands as the last major Allied power in Western Europe. The Soviet Union is fighting desperately on the Eastern Front. The United States has entered the war, but is still building up its forces. The Allies need a victory. They need to open a second front in Europe to take pressure off the Soviets. They need to show that Nazi Germany can be beaten. The target is obvious. Sicily, the large Italian island in the Mediterranean. Conquering Sicily would give the Allies a foothold in southern Europe. It would threaten Mussolini's fascist Italy directly. It would provide air bases to bomb Nazi-occupied territories. It was the logical next step in the Mediterranean campaign. There was just one enormous problem. The target was too obvious. German intelligence wasn't stupid. They could look at a map as easily as the Allies could. Sicily was the most strategically valuable target in the Mediterranean. The Germans knew the Allies would eventually try to take it, so they were preparing defenses, positioning troops, and fortifying the island. If the Allies invaded Sicily against a fully prepared defense, casualties would be catastrophic. The invasion might fail entirely. At minimum, it would be a bloodbath that could delay Allied operations for months or even years. The Allies needed the Germans to look somewhere else. They needed to convince Hitler that Sicily wasn't the target, that the invasion would come somewhere else, anywhere else. This is where British intelligence came in. Specifically, a department so secret that most of the British government didn't know it existed. The 20 Committee, also called the double-cross system, because 20 in Roman numerals is XX. Double cross. Get it? This committee specialized in deception operations. They ran double agents. They fed false information to German intelligence. They created elaborate lies designed to mislead Nazi strategic planning. Two men in particular would conceive Operation Mincemeat: Ewan Montague, a naval intelligence officer and lawyer, and Charles Cholmondeley, and RAF Flight Lieutenant. Both were members of the 20 Committee. Both understood how German intelligence worked, and both were willing to think in ways that conventional military minds wouldn't dare. The idea started with a memo, not from Montague or Cholmondeley, but from an earlier intelligence officer named Ian Fleming. Yes, that Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond, in 1939. Before the war really started, Fleming had written a memo outlining possible deception strategies. One idea was particularly striking: What if you took a dead body, dressed it as a courier carrying important documents, and arranged for the body to wash up where the enemy would find it? The enemy would think they'd intercepted genuine intelligence, they'd act on it, and you'd have successfully fed them false information. Fleming called it the Trojan horse principle. The Greeks couldn't take Troy by force, so they used deception, a gift that was actually a weapon. A dead body carrying false plans could be the modern equivalent. The idea sat in intelligence files for years, but in late 1942, as the Sicily invasion was being planned, Montague and Cholmondeley pulled out Fleming's memo. They looked at each other. They realized this insane idea might actually work, but there were enormous challenges. First, they needed a body. Not just any body. A body that could pass as a recently drowned British officer. A body that German and Spanish doctors wouldn't immediately identify as suspicious. Second, they needed a convincing identity. The dead man would need a name, a rank, a background. Documents that would stand up to scrutiny. Personal effects that would make him seem real. Third, they needed to create documents convincing enough to fool German intelligence. These couldn't be obvious fakes. They had to be subtle, genuine-looking correspondence that accidentally revealed invasion plans. Fourth, they needed to get the body to the right place. Somewhere the Spanish would find it. Somewhere Spain would share information with German intelligence. But somewhere that wouldn't seem too convenient or staged. And finally, they needed to do all of this in complete secrecy. If word leaked, if the Germans suspected deception, the entire operation would fail and potentially compromise other Allied operations. It was an impossible plan, which is exactly why Montague and Cholmondeley thought it might work. The Germans would never expect the British to do something this elaborate, this theatrical, this morbid. They pitched the idea to their superiors. To their surprise, the plan was approved. The code name was chosen, Operation Mincemeat, a darkly appropriate name for a plan involving a corpse as bait. Now they just had to pull it off. The first challenge was finding a body. This was harder than it sounds. They couldn't just use any corpse. The body had to meet very specific criteria. It had to be a man in his 30s or early 40s, the right age for a military officer. It had to be relatively intact, not obviously diseased or damaged in ways inconsistent with drowning. It had to have died recently enough that decomposition wouldn't be too advanced. And most importantly, they needed permission from the family or authorities to use the body for a secret military operation. That last requirement was nearly impossible. How do you ask someone for permission to use their dead relative in an elaborate spy operation, without explaining what the operation is? Montague made discreet inquiries through contacts in London hospitals and morgues. He explained that the military needed a body for a secret operation that could save lives. He couldn't provide details, but it was legitimate and approved at the highest levels. Most people said no, understandably. Even in wartime, the idea of using someone's body as a prop in a military deception was deeply unsettling. But eventually, they found someone. A man had died in London. The exact identity is still debated by historians. For decades, researchers believed it was a homeless Welshman named Glinda Michael, who died from eating rat poison containing phosphorus. Recent research suggests it might have been someone else entirely. The British government kept a true identity classified for 60 years. What we know for certain is that Montague obtained a body, a man in his 30s, dead from causes that could plausibly be explained as drowning, specifically pneumonia, which leaves fluid in the lungs similar to drowning. The body was stored in a morgue, kept cold to slow decomposition. Now came the theatrical part, creating a person. They decided to call him Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They chose Royal Marines specifically because it explained why he'd be carrying sensitive documents. Marines often served as couriers for naval operations, but Major Martin couldn't just be a name and rank. He needed to be a real person, someone with a life, a personality, a history. Because the Germans would investigate, they'd look for inconsistencies. Any detail that seemed false would make them suspicious of everything. So Montague and Cholmondeley created an entire fictional life. Major Martin was engaged to be married. They created love letters from his fiancée, a woman they named Pam. These letters were written by a secretary in the intelligence office, who poured real emotion into them. They referenced real places in London. They mentioned friends and family. They talked about wedding plans and hopes for after the war. The letters were brilliant misdirection. If German intelligence found them, they'd make Major Martin seem more real, more human, who would create fake love letters for a fake person. The attention to detail would make the deception more convincing. They added more personal effects. Theatre ticket stubs from London shows, a receipt from a jeweller for an engagement ring, an angry letter from his bank about an overdrawn account, keys, cigarettes, small change, all the random items a real person would carry. They even included a photograph. A young woman they claimed was Pam, his fiancée. The photo was actually of a clerk in Mi-5 who volunteered to pose. In the photograph, she's smiling, looking at the camera with affection. Any German officer seeing that photo would think of his own wife or girlfriend, would see Major Martin as a real person. The genius of these details is that they served no operational purpose. The love letters didn't help the deception about Sicily. The theatre stubs didn't reveal any intelligence, but they made everything else more believable. They made German intelligence think, if the British faked this, why would they include all these irrelevant personal details? Now they needed to dress the body. This required incredible attention to detail. Major Martin wore a proper Royal Marine uniform. The rank insignia had to be correct. The ribbons indicating service medals had to be appropriate for someone of his age and supposed experience. His boots were slightly worn. New boots would seem suspicious. His uniform showed normal wear. They added small tears and stains consistent with someone who'd been in military service. They put the body in a Mae West life jacket, the type worn by airmen and naval personnel. This explained why the body would be floating rather than having sunk immediately. And most importantly, they attached a briefcase to his wrist with a chain. This was standard procedure for couriers carrying sensitive documents. The chain made it look like Major Martin had been protecting the documents even as he drowned. Inside the briefcase were the crucial documents. These weren't crude forgeries. They were genuine British government stationery, authentic formats, real signatures from actual high-ranking officers. The main document was a letter from Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander, who commanded British forces in North Africa. The letter was chatty, informal, discussing various operational matters, and buried in the middle, almost casually, was a reference to invasion plans. The letter mentioned that the Allies were planning two major operations. One would target Greece, the other would target Sardinia, another Italian island west of the Italian mainland. Sicily was mentioned only briefly, as a cover for the real invasions. The brilliance was in how casual it was. This wasn't a document labeled Top Secret Invasion Plans. It was correspondence between two generals discussing operational details, the kind of letter that might genuinely be carried by a courier. And the invasion information was subtle enough that it seemed accidentally revealed, rather than deliberately stated. There were other documents too. A letter of introduction from Major Martin, a notice about combined operations training, more routine military paperwork, all of it designed to look like a courier's typical load. Everything was ready. The body, the identity, the documents. Now they needed to get Major Martin into the water off Spain where he'd be found, his secrets discovered, and the Germans deceived. The delivery method was crucial. They couldn't just dump a body off any beach. The location had to make sense. Why would a British officer carrying sensitive documents end up in the water off Spain? They created a cover story. Major Martin had been flying from Britain to Allied headquarters in North Africa. His plane had experienced difficulties over the Mediterranean. He'd either died in a crash or bailed out but drowned before reaching safety. His body had drifted to the Spanish coast. This explains several things: why he was wearing a life jacket, why he had documents meant for North Africa, why he ended up near Spain, which was roughly along that flight path. The location they chose was Huelva, a town on Spain's southern Atlantic coast, just west of Gibraltar. Huelva was perfect for several reasons. First, the currents and tides made it plausible that a body could wash up there from a plane crash in the Mediterranean or Atlantic. Second, Spain was officially neutral, but everyone knew they were friendly toward Nazi Germany. The Spanish government regularly shared intelligence with Berlin. If the Spanish found sensitive British documents, they'd definitely tell the Germans. Third, there was a known German intelligence officer in Huelva, Adolf Kloss, who ran a network of agents for the Abwehr, German military intelligence. If documents surfaced in Huelva, Kloss would hear about it immediately. On April 19, 1943, the operation began. The body, sealed in a special canister filled with dry ice to preserve it, was loaded aboard HMS Sraf, a British submarine. The submarine's crew wasn't told what they were carrying or why. Only the captain knew the full plan. The Sraf sailed from Scotland toward Spain. It was a tense journey. The submarine had to avoid German and Spanish patrols. It had to reach the release point at exactly the right time, when tides and currents would carry the body to shore within a day or two. On April 30th, before dawn, the Sraf surfaced about a mile off the coast of Huelva. The crew brought the canister on deck. Inside, preserved in dry ice, was Major William Martin. Ewan Montague had travelled on the submarine to personally oversee this part. He and the crew carefully removed the body from the canister. They inflated the Mae West life jackets so the body would float face down, which is how drowning victims naturally float. They placed Major Martin in the water. The briefcase was chained to his wrist. The documents inside were sealed in waterproof containers, but not too waterproof. They needed to look like they'd been in the water, but still be readable. Montague said a prayer. Yes, actually. Despite the deception, despite using this body as a prop in an intelligence operation, Montague felt it was important to acknowledge the humanity of what they were doing. He read a brief passage, asking forgiveness for what necessity had required. Then they let the current take Major Martin away. The submarine submerged and sailed away. Now all they could do was wait and hope that their elaborate plan would work. Within hours, Spanish fishermen spotted the body. Local authorities were notified. The body was recovered and taken to Huelva. Spanish officials examined it and immediately recognized it as a British military officer. From the uniform and identification, the British vice-consul in Huelva was notified. He came to identify the body and request its return. He seemed appropriately distressed. He asked about the briefcase. Were there any documents? This was all part of the act. The British needed to seem concerned about the documents without being too insistent, which would seem suspicious. The Spanish authorities assured him the body would be returned with full military honors. But first, they needed to examine everything thoroughly, including the briefcase. This is exactly what Montague had predicted. Spain, trying to maintain the appearance of neutrality while actually cooperating with Germany, would look at those documents before returning them. The briefcase was opened. The documents were photographed. Spanish intelligence reviewed them, and then, as expected, copies were sent to German intelligence. Adolf Kloss, the German agent in Huelva, received the documents. He immediately recognized their potential importance. He sent them to Abwehr headquarters in Berlin with a note stating that these appeared to be genuine Allied invasion plans. Back in London, Montague waited nervously. The British had ways of monitoring German communications. They'd know fairly quickly whether the Germans had taken the bait. The Spanish returned Major Martin's body to British authorities. A funeral was held in Huelva. The British vice-consul attended, playing his role perfectly. Major William Martin was buried in a Spanish cemetery with full military honors. A headstone was erected marking his grave. And in Berlin, German intelligence was analyzing the captured documents. The documents reached Hitler's desk on May 9, 1943. 9 days after Major Martin's body washed ashore. 9 days during which German intelligence had been analyzing, debating, and ultimately believing what they'd found. The Germans did exactly what Montagu hoped they'd do. They investigated. They looked for inconsistencies. They tried to verify Major Martin's identity. German intelligence contacted their agents in London. Did a Major William Martin exist in the Royal Marines? Yes. The Germans found records confirming his existence. What they didn't know was that Montagu had actually created those records, inserting Major Martin into military databases. They investigated the signatures on the documents. Were they genuine? German experts compared the signatures to known examples of British generals' handwriting. They matched. Because they were real signatures, Montagu had gotten actual British generals to sign the cover letters, though the generals knew the letters contained false information. They analyzed the paper, the typewriters, the official seals. Everything checked out, because they were genuine British materials. German intelligence even tried to verify details from the personal effects, the theatre tickets, the bank letter, the engagement ring receipt. All of these checked out as real London establishments and genuine documents. The love letters from Palm were particularly convincing. German intelligence officers read them and saw authentic emotion, real human connection. One German officer was reportedly moved by the letters, commenting that it was tragic. This young man had died before marrying his sweetheart. That's the power of good deception. The Germans didn't just believe the military documents. They believed in Major William Martin as a person. And once you believe the man is real, it's much easier to believe his documents are genuine. But the Germans weren't completely convinced. Not yet. They knew the British were capable of deception. They knew this could potentially be a trick. So they looked for corroboration. And remarkably, they found it. Sort of. German intelligence had other sources of information about Allied intentions. Intercepted radio traffic, reports from agents, aerial reconnaissance, diplomatic chatter. And when they looked at these other sources through the lens of what the Mincemeat documents claimed, suddenly everything seemed to fit. The Allies had been conducting military exercises in the Mediterranean that could support operations in Greece or Sardinia. There had been increased diplomatic activity with Turkey, which bordered Greece. Supply movements seemed consistent with operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. None of this actually proved the Mincemeat documents were real, but it was consistent with them. And that was enough. This is a crucial lesson in how intelligence analysis works. Once you believe something, you tend to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting that belief. The Germans wanted to know where the Allies would strike. The Mincemeat documents gave them an answer. And then they found evidence that seemed to support that answer, even though that evidence was actually ambiguous or coincidental. On May 12th, just 12 days after Major Martin washed ashore, German High Command issued new orders. Based on the intelligence from the Huelva documents, they were repositioning forces to defend against Allied invasions of Greece and Sardinia. Crucially, they reduced forces in Sicily, the island the Allies actually planned to invade. The Germans moved an entire panzer division from Sicily to Greece. They reinforced Sardinia with additional troops and coastal defenses. They positioned naval and air assets to respond to Allied operations in those areas. Hitler personally became convinced that Greece was the primary target. He had always worried about the Balkans, seeing them as strategically vital. The Mincemeat documents confirmed his pre-existing concerns, which made them even more believable. In Berlin, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, reviewed the intelligence. He considered the possibility of deception, but ultimately concluded the documents were probably genuine. The level of detail was too great, the corroborating evidence too consistent, and the British had been too obviously concerned about recovering the briefcase. That last point is interesting. When British officials in Spain had asked about the briefcase and documents, they'd seemed worried but not panicked. If the documents were truly fake, the Germans reasoned, the British would either not care at all or would be obviously faking concern. The measured, professional British response seemed authentic. They were being deceived by layers of deception. The British concern was fake but performed so well that it seemed real, which made the fake documents seem real too. By mid-May 1943, the Germans had completely bought the deception. They had repositioned forces based on false intelligence. They were defending the wrong targets. And in London, British intelligence knew it. They'd intercepted German communications. They'd seen the troop movements. They knew Operation Mincemeat had worked beyond their wildest expectations. Churchill was informed. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces, was told the Germans had taken the bait. The Sicily invasion, scheduled for July, would face significantly reduced opposition because of a corpse and some fake documents. Montague and Cholmondeley had pulled it off. Their insane plan had actually worked. But the operation wasn't over yet. They still had to invade Sicily and see if the deception held up under the reality of actual combat. July 9, 1943, 2 months after Major Martin washed ashore in Spain, the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, began. Allied forces, American and British, landed on Sicily's southern coast. Over 150,000 troops in the initial assault. Hundreds of ships. Thousands of aircraft. It was one of the largest amphibious operations of the war to that point. The Germans were taken by surprise. Not completely. They knew an invasion was coming somewhere in the Mediterranean, but they'd positioned forces to defend Greece and Sardinia. Sicily's defenses were significantly weaker than they would have been without Operation Mincemeat. The Italian forces defending Sicily, already demoralized and poorly equipped, crumbled quickly. German units fought harder, but they were outnumbered and couldn't hold the beaches. Within days, the Allies had secured a firm foothold on the island. The invasion succeeded. Casualties were far lower than expected. Instead of a potential bloodbath, Operation Husky became a decisive Allied victory. By August 17th, just over a month after the initial landings, Sicily was entirely under Allied control. The strategic impact was enormous. Mussolini's fascist government in Italy collapsed. Italy would soon switch sides and join the Allies. The Mediterranean sea lanes became safer for Allied shipping. Allied aircraft could now operate from Sicilian bases, bringing most of southern Europe within bombing range. And all of this was made possible, at least in part, by Operation Mincemeat, by a corpse with fake documents that convinced Hitler to defend the wrong island. After the Sicily campaign, British intelligence carefully monitored German communications to see if the Germans realized they'd been deceived. Remarkably, they didn't. Not at first. Even after Sicily fell, many German commanders believed that Greece or Sardinia had been the real targets, and Sicily was just an opportunistic diversion. The deception was so well crafted that some Germans couldn't accept they'd been fooled. It took months before German intelligence began to suspect Operation Mincemeat might have been a deception. By then, it didn't matter. Sicily was lost. Italy had switched sides. The strategic situation had changed completely. Admiral Canaris, head of German intelligence, reportedly said after the war that Operation Mincemeat was the most effective intelligence deception of the entire war. Coming from the man who'd been fooled by it, that's quite an acknowledgement. But there's a darker epilogue to consider. Major William Martin, the man who never existed, had a real impact on real lives. German forces defending Greece and Sardinia fought against invasions that never came. Italian civilians on those islands prepared for battles that didn't happen. Resources were wasted defending the wrong places. And most significantly, German forces were pulled away from Sicily, which meant German soldiers died there who might have survived if the defenses had been stronger. This is the grim arithmetic of war. Operation Mincemeat saved Allied lives by ensuring more German and Italian soldiers would die or be captured in Sicily. The body used for Major Martin was buried in Huelva, Spain. The grave still exists. For decades, it simply said Major William Martin, Royal Marines. The British maintained the deception even after the war, not wanting to reveal the true identity of the body. In the 1990s, After the operation was fully declassified, researchers began investigating who the real person was. As mentioned earlier, for years it was believed to be Glinda Michael, a Welsh homeless man. Recent research suggests it might have been someone else, possibly a young man who died in a more prominent circumstance, whose family agreed to the use, but wanted secrecy maintained. The British government has never officially confirmed the identity. Some details remain classified even now, 80 years later, perhaps out of respect for the family, perhaps because some aspects of the operation involved methods that might still be sensitive. The grave in Huelva was updated in the 1990s. It now includes a plaque acknowledging the deception. It reads, in part, William Martin, a name assumed for an operation that helped to win the war. Tourists visit the grave. It's become a small memorial to one of history's most successful intelligence operations. Ewan Montague, who conceived and executed Operation Mincemeat, wrote a book about it in 1953 called The Man Who Never Was. It became a bestseller and was adapted into a film in 1956. Montague was careful not to reveal details that were still classified, but he told enough of the story to give the public a sense of the operation's audacity. Charles Cholmondeley, who worked with Montague on the plan, remained more private. He rarely gave interviews and didn't seek credit for the operation. He died in 1985, having never written his own account of Operation Mincemeat. Ian Fleming, whose original memo inspired the operation, went on to write the James Bond novels. Some scholars argue that his experience with real intelligence operations, like Mincemeat, influenced his fiction. The elaborate deceptions, the attention to detail, the theatrical nature of Bond stories all echo real British intelligence work during the war. The legacy of Operation Mincemeat extended beyond World War II. It became a template for how intelligence services think about deception. The principles used creating a believable identity, using genuine materials, thinking about how the enemy analyzes intelligence. Layers of corroborating details became standard doctrine. Modern intelligence services still study Operation Mincemeat, not because they're going to use corpses with fake documents, but because the psychological and operational principles remain relevant. How do you make a lie believable? How do you anticipate how your enemy will investigate your deception? How do you use their preconceptions against them? So what made Operation Mincemeat so successful? Why did this bizarre plan work when so many things could have gone wrong? First, the attention to detail. Montague and Cholmondeley didn't just create fake documents. They created an entire person. The love letters, the theatre tickets, the bank overdraft notice. None of these details were operationally necessary, but they made Major Martin feel real. And once the Germans believed in Major Martin as a person, they were more likely to believe his documents were genuine. Second, they understood their enemy. Montague knew how German intelligence worked. He knew they'd investigate thoroughly. He knew they'd look for corroboration from other sources. So he created a deception that would hold up under scrutiny and that would seem to be confirmed by ambiguous evidence the Germans already had. Third, the deception was plausible. Greece and Sardinia were legitimate potential invasion targets. The Germans already worried about those locations. Operation Mincemeat didn't ask the Germans to believe something completely implausible. It confirmed what they already suspected might be true. Fourth, they got lucky. Not everything was under British control. The body had to wash up in the right place at the right time. Spanish authorities had to find it and share the documents with Germany. The Germans had to believe the documents rather than dismiss them as obvious fakes. Any of these things could have gone wrong, but they didn't. The operation succeeded beyond expectations, and Sicily was invaded with minimal resistance compared to what it could have been. There's a philosophical question at the heart of Operation Mincemeat. Was it ethical to use a corpse this way? To create an entirely fake identity for someone who was once a real person? To bury them under a false name in a foreign country? Montague wrestled with this question. He acknowledged the operation was macabre, but he argued it was justified because it saved lives. The reduced German defenses in Sicily meant fewer Allied soldiers died in the invasion. Wasn't that worth the moral compromise of using a body as a deception prop? Different people will answer that question differently. What's undeniable is that Operation Mincemeat worked. It achieved its objective. It helped win a crucial campaign, and it did so through creativity, planning, and psychological manipulation rather than firepower. In many ways, Operation Mincemeat represents intelligence work at its finest, taking minimal resources, a body, some fake documents, and achieving strategic impact, using the enemy's own intelligence processes against them, winning through deception rather than destruction. It's also a reminder of how warfare has always had this dimension. Wars aren't won purely through battles and bombing. They're won through intelligence, through logistics, through morale, through countless factors beyond just who has more soldiers or better weapons. Operation Mincemeat was warfare as theater, as creative writing, as psychological manipulation, and it was devastatingly effective. The operation also highlighted the importance of questioning intelligence. The Germans had good reason to be suspicious. A courier carrying sensitive documents just happens to wash up where they can be found. That should have raised red flags. But the Germans wanted to believe the documents because it gave them actionable intelligence. They wanted answers about where the Allies would strike. This is a recurring problem in intelligence work. Sometimes you believe what you want to believe rather than what the evidence actually supports. The Germans fell into this trap with Operation Mincemeat, and it cost them Sicily. Modern intelligence training uses Operation Mincemeat as a case study in both successful deception and failed intelligence analysis. How do you create a believable deception? Study Montagu's work. How do you avoid being deceived? Study how the Germans failed to see through it. Let me tell you one final detail about Operation Mincemeat, because it shows how thorough Montagu and Cholmondeley were in creating their deception. When Major Martin's body washed ashore, the Spanish authorities didn't just find his briefcase and identification. They found a receipt in his pocket. A receipt from a London jeweler for an engagement ring. 53. A significant sum in 1943. Spanish authorities could have verified this receipt. They could have contacted the jeweler, asked if Major William Martin had actually purchased a ring. And if they had, they would have found that yes, someone matching that description had been in the shop and purchased an engagement ring for exactly that amount on exactly that date. Because Montagu had actually gone to the jeweler. He'd purchased the ring. He'd gotten a genuine receipt. He'd created a paper trail that would check out if anyone investigated. That's the level of detail that made Operation Mincemeat succeed. Not just creating fake documents, but creating an entire verifiable reality. Every detail that could be checked was made to check out. Every aspect of Major Martin's fictional life had some basis in actual reality. The Germans investigated. They checked what they could check. And everything confirmed the story. So they believed it. And because they believed it, they moved their forces. And because they moved their forces, Sicily fell more easily. And because Sicily fell, Italy collapsed. And the Allies gained momentum that would eventually lead to victory in Europe. All because of a corpse, a briefcase, and the most elaborate lie ever told. This is Echoes of WW2. Operation Mincemeat was conceived in 1942, executed in 1943, and remained classified until the 1990s. It involved a handful of intelligence officers, one body, and fake documents that changed the course of the war. Your history teacher probably mentioned the invasion of Sicily, but they probably didn't tell you about the dead man who made it possible. About Major William Martin, the officer who never existed but whose fake death helped win a real war. Now you know. Now you know that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't guns or bombs or tanks. Sometimes it's a convincing story. A dead body with secrets. A lie so carefully crafted that even the most suspicious minds believe it. Now you know the story of Operation Mincemeat. The corpse that fooled Hitler.